So thank you for joining the session. Kind of interesting, the insights that Ronald gave in his presentation, a colleague from Tenable, kind of like similar things. We see a lot of like the initial access, gaining privileges, moving laterally, all that kind of fun stuff. We as Delinea, we deal with PAM. I'll come back to that in a second. What is PAM? What do we do with that? PAM is like a very short acronym when it comes to our security industry. Like we have enough acronyms, but it pretty much like entails like what do we deal with? What do we want to do in that specific scenario? What do we want to work with? So what we've done as a company, we've looked at how can we help organizations when it comes to PAM from this I don't have anything or I have very little to something more sophisticated that actually helps you on dealing with privileges and accounts in an environment. So briefly, just about myself, just who am I? So my name is Patrick van der Veen. I run the pre-sales organization for our team in Northern Europe, so based here out of the Netherlands, working with a team for like Benelux, Nordics, and UK and Ireland. Been with Delinea for 3.5 years. People might have seen the name Delinea, people might have seen the name Thycotic, people might have seen the name Centrify. We're all the same company. Delinea, we started as a company like a year and a half ago, where we introduced our new name, but essentially we originated from a merger between Thycotic and Centrify. I'm originally from the Thycotic side of the house, but dealing with like our full portfolio these days. I've been doing pre-sales for quite a few years now, been doing a lot of different things, technologies, like started originally in the world of infrastructure and virtualization, workspace management, but over time changed into the security world and also there seen different things like vulnerability management, detection and response, and the last few years I've been dealing with PAM, where PAM is kind of like, I tend to say like it's a non-sexy security measure, like really basic, because to a degree we're talking about, in the most elementary form, about a vault with passwords in it. Like how non-sexy is that, dealing with passwords? It's not flashy, it's not called next gen, but I think it's a really important security measure when we talk about that. And the reason why PAM is important essentially, is how we deal with that. So it's just like more like funs and giggles, laughs and giggles. Like, what does PAM actually stand for? I saw Ronald use a version of it, but it kind of depends on how far are you in that stage. So, pulse amplitude modulation. Like, if you Google PAM, this is one of the results you actually get. So it's probably not what we do. Privileged account management kind of covers something, I would think. In our branch or our security industry, prayers and miracles. It's a common one, because if you've seen the presentation from Ronald and from the colleague of Tenable, there's a lot of stuff that is being thrown at us that we need to deal with. So occasionally it's like keeping your fingers crossed and like, oh, what's going on? And the last one, privileged access management. So just like the quick poll, who thinks it's like number one, like the pulse amplitude modulation, probably no one. Privileged account management, few hands. Prayers and miracles, I'm fond of that one usually. And of course, last one, privileged access management, like majority of hands. So privileged access or privileged account management is not like the wrong definition of the acronym, because in the end we are dealing with privileged accounts. And for a lot of organizations, this really is the starting point as to how do we deal with our privileged accounts in the environment. But what you really want to think about is privileged access management. So how do I give a user that needs privileges the privileges that he needs? Can he use a privileged account for that? Yeah, very likely. But how do we facilitate the usage and what do we do with all that kind of fun stuff? And that's kind of what we, like with the PAM Maturity framework, what we try to achieve. And the nice thing is, and it's kind of like, I'll come back to that also in a bit, our maturity framework is not specifically to us. Like if you would map that to one of our competitors, same concept and same ideas can be used in that specific scenario. And as we've kind of seen, like we'll think people or organizations get hacked through all kind of fancy stuff. I think the canonical pipeline example that was used earlier, incorrectly wrong VPN concentrator, I believe it even was like a username and password. It was pretty default. I think like, what was it? Gemeentehof van Twente, admin welcome 123 or something like that. So it's, attacks don't happen like with the fancy, like what we all know from the Hollywood movies, hackers in their hoodies and like fancy screens, etc. Well, people log in. And of course, like when the initial foothold happens, people need to move sideways and get more privileges, because if they're on an endpoint with just standard credentials, very little impact they can have or can do. So privilege management is important. So like tackling vulnerabilities is of course keys. But what we quite often see, that initial foothold, so how do people get in? Well, people click on stuff. It's kind of like that, don't click on stupid stuff, people. But also people log in, like where do we have our privileges, or are users privileged or over-privileged? So a lot of the breaches involve a sort of privileged access, because that's the end goal. Like if a user or an attacker is just a standard user, they can't get very far. The second they get privileges, and that can be starting on a local machine, getting local admin rights, getting more rights in the domain or in the network, and then move sideways and even more, get more and more credentials. But in the end, privileged accounts are involved, because that tends to be the end goal. A lot of items happen through compromised endpoints. So getting that visibility and tackling that, and that's where like the likes of like CrowdStrike come into play. Like how can we make that endpoint as secure as possible? But also what you can think of is, why do users need local administrative rights? But let's just get rid of that, because if they don't have administrative rights, an attacker gets on the endpoint, and then they need to exploit something vulnerable that gives them system or administrative rights. But if the user itself doesn't have any rights, there's very little they can do. And that's also where, like this is a statement from Microsoft, is a lot of critical vulnerabilities can be mitigated if a user doesn't have administrative rights. So removing local administrative rights is something that's relevant there. So privileges is like important, and we see that on a lot of different areas in that scenario. But like, how do you deal with all this stuff? Because there's a lot of different places that we want to deal with privileges, and I think these days it even gets more and more. Yes, of course, most of organizations still have their classic Active Directory. They have their workstations. Now, workstations tend to be moved into, let's say, Azure AD or Azure AD joined. But that's more from a user consumption standpoint. If you look at how our servers or applications being serviced, that's where a lot of diversity happens. So it's no longer just that Active Directory that we need to deal with. It's cloud, it's infrastructure, infrastructure as code, automation, all that kind of fun stuff that we want to deal with. So how do we get from in these different areas, essentially? Kind of like re-emphasizing, most attacks use something with privileged access. And it's not just us, like it's not just an admin, it's a, pull this slightly up, allows me to move my head not just from left to right, but also up and down. It's of course, it's like your internal IT admin department, security team, help desk, but also like third parties that you deal with. Like how do you make sure that the third party that you're dealing with, how do you give them secure access and have them managing the environment? So kind of privileged accounts that we're targeting, things like local admins, root account on Linux boxes, domain admins, a Cisco device with enablement, like all these different things, moving bits and pieces that exist in the environment, deal with privileges that we want to tackle, that we want to deal with. But it also includes like applications. So how does an application authenticate against the backend database? Are we having a service running on a machine, running an application? And what kind of rights does that application actually have? Are we updating, in the most simple form, the password of such an account on a regular basis? So how do we go about doing this? Because in the end, almost every user has a form of privilege, being that a technical privilege, being that a data access privilege. Because if an attacker doesn't have like broad administrative rights in an infrastructure, they just are as a user. But that user happens to be like a main like CRM application administrator and has access to all data there. Like data exfiltration becomes more of the option versus getting like ransomware or something, but it's more like exfiltration, get stuff out of there. So looking at what kind of privileges are out there, how is it being used, and how do we deal with all these different scenarios? And that's really where we try to help organizations on getting from that, like I have nothing, it's like pretty basic, but how do we deal with these privileges, and how do we move forward instead of just managing like a username and password combination, but also potentially looking at how do we temporarily give users privileged access, and the steps that are involved with that. So what we've done is we've taken, like, or we created this PAM Maturity Model where we essentially say in this first phase, high risk, nothing happens. Phase 1 is like visibility, let's like reduce the attack surface. In this phase 2, we're saying let's use like policies and limit overprivileged users. So why, like an admin, why does an admin needs to be domain admin? Like, can we remove those permissions and just give him when they need them, where he needs them? And this last phase essentially is more and more around automation, is getting visibility and intelligence. Where are people using privileges? When are they using privileges? And if we're seeing something that's out of the ordinary, how can we act on that essentially? And this phase 0, this high risk, we see a lot of organizations still being in that specific area. A lot of things are being done. Let's say, for example, if you're like in healthcare world doing NEN 5.17, or if you're like doing ISO or something, there's always something being mentioned around managing of privileged accounts or managing passwords or having password complexity rules and things like that. We still see a lot of organizations, even when they have a variety of security related or like organizational securities or certifications, is when the question is being asked, like, how do you deal or how do you manage your privileged accounts? We have a key pass. The key pass is stored on the network somewhere on a share. Who has access to that key pass? The whole IT department. How many copies of that key pass file are actually there? Well, we have no idea. Do people, like, do you change the information there on a regular basis? Well, if not, like, what's holding someone back to go into the key pass file once, copy the password of an account, and store it in their own key pass? Because it's so much easier than going into that centrally managed one. We even see companies that still have the, look, we've got an Excel sheet with a password on network share. It happens. And it happens more than you would think. We have a customer that before they started using us, like, they had a very bad breach. They recovered from that. And then the process to get privileged access was essentially you would have to walk to your manager. Your manager would have like this actual paper book. You could get the password from him, and you could walk back, and that was seen as secure. Where, of course, if that password doesn't change, because it's written down and it's not being updated on a regular basis, like, what's the use? But like from a process standpoint, they were like, oh, we have more control on who has access to privileges now. And that's really what we want to change and move away from. So these 3 different phases is where we help organizations moving along in that journey. So let's talk a bit more detail on that phase 0. So the first thing really that we want to do is, let's say, like, visibility and reduce the attack surface. So visibility is on one hand discovery which privileged accounts exist in the environment. That can be a technical thing or technical question, but you also need to look at what your business processes are. What are our most vulnerable, or what are our most critical applications, and what credentials are being used to access that information. If we have that insight, as in we know what's out there, we know what's really important for us, let's make sure that we put it in a central location in a secure fashion. So, like, the vault comes in as a play. Like, secure vault, centralized, and it's not just like the vault, like a key pass is of course also a vault, but we want to have more information. We want to make sure that the right people have access to the right information. So role-based access control. If people are using that information, we want to get an audit trail. But we don't want to have a static vault. We don't want to have static information stored there. We want to have, like, on a regular basis, change that information. So in the most simple example, on a monthly basis or a daily basis or a weekly basis, change the password of the accounts that we're managing in the environment. So that's really where you're going into the privileged account management idea. I have privileged accounts, I want to manage them, and I'll make them more dynamic. And before I get access, I want to do that in a secure fashion. So multi-factor authentication. If I log into that vault, I need to prove who I am. And it's not just my username and password. I need to really prove who I am, with all the role-based access around that. But it's not just, oh, we have a vault, we have everything stored centrally. But what I also want to do is make the life of users using that information more efficient. I don't want an admin to go in, look up a specific administrative user or a service account, copy the password, take that password back to like another application or RDP or SSH or something else, and paste that password in. No, what we want to do is we want to inject those credentials in a session that they can launch. So we can work towards a method or a model where, as a user or an administrator, I don't even see the password anymore. I don't know the password, and there's no need for me to know the password, because if I want to use the account and connect to a system, I can click a link, and off we go. So that first phase is really like the basics, what we're doing there. And on the left side, we see some like products that we have in the portfolio. I won't go like super in depth on that. Like Secret Service, our Vault Connection Manager facilitates the usage of those credentials. And we also, of course, have people that are not in the network, but they need secure remote access, and that's what Remote Access Service does. So basically, with these steps, you can get more control around that. And it's, the interesting thing is like we're seeing more and more around this, where like a few years ago, LastPass was sufficient, or like, sorry, like a KeyPass or like a password manager was sufficient for organizations. Auditors are now pushing more and more like, well, you really need to do something about this. How often are you changing your passwords? Are you changing a service account's password, et cetera, et cetera? So getting into that phase is really, really important. This is like the written summary. I won't go into that. As Ronald said, we'll be publishing the slides. They'll send a link, which apparently is going to be trustworthy, so let's see about that. But how then we go into that in that second phase? And the second phase is really where we want to take that a step further. So we have those privileged accounts, but maybe you come to the conclusion that you have 1,000 domain admins. That's a lot of accounts that are potentially targeted for abuse. Maybe every user is local admin. We want to get rid of that. So how do you go about doing that? And that's really where what we call like privilege elevation comes into play, in a really the more basic form. When we target end users, I'm a standard user, I'm on my laptop. I can run 95% of everything that I need to do, I can do without local administrative rights, but there is the exception. And how do I deal with that? Do I tell the user, go to the help desk if you need to do something or install something? Or can we introduce a mechanism that automatically elevates that process when it needs those administrative rights, based on automation, based on policy, like workflow, reasoning behind it, etc. So we can lock down endpoints in a more efficient way. So privilege elevation from an end user standpoint, but also from an administrative standpoint, where we want to make life more easy. And these privileges, they need to be time-based. Like, it's not just that I need administrative rights always. To do a specific task, I need privileged rights, and I need them where I am and for the duration that I'm actually using them. So it's more like going into the just-in-time and just-enough scenarios that we're doing there. And these different things essentially has all been talking around more like the user access. So I'm a user, I'm an administrator, I'm a user on a workstation. But we're also doing these more and more automated deployments, so infrastructure as code, like deploying infrastructure, deploying software, using RPA, like robotic process automation. Like, how do we deal with that? Because those applications and systems also need privileges or access to privileged accounts. And that's where these items come into play, like DevOps, RPA. These type of applications should also be integrated with that central PAM solution, because the central PAM solution is responsible for privileges for privileged accounts. And if an application wants to use them, we shouldn't want to store, like, take the examples, a UiPath, Automation Anywhere, that's more the RPA side. If you talk about a Jenkins or an Ansible or a Terraform, they all have their own kind of like internal mini vaults where they can store credentials in their own small vault. But the whole idea was from phase one is let's get these privileged accounts and get them into a central place, and we don't want to put them in all these decentralized places again. So that's why we're saying, let's integrate those type of applications with your central application and make sure that they can use those systems or use those credentials or applications to do what they need to do, and also giving us the ability to, instead of configuring this static credential in a UiPath or something like that, is we can change that password on a regular basis, and every time UiPath wants to do something, it needs to reach out to the central location, get the most recent credentials, and use them for what it needs to do. So again, more dynamics. So this also helps because you're getting more and more dynamics from a security standpoint. If an attacker comes in, would get like a password hash of a user, maybe or from a service account, maybe the hash itself can't be cracked because it's like a super long password, gonna take very long. Like pass the hash attacks are still a valid thing, but if the password essentially gets changed on such a regular basis, the amount of time they can like have fun with that is going to get reduced. So there's like all this balancing stuff that we want to do. And of course, like it's not removing or revoking the need to do like additional monitoring, because in the end, from on network level, and I think that's also on AD level, I think the Tenable team will present something on that, like the Vectra team from a network standpoint, like how do you also detect this kind of abuse attacks that's happening in the environment. But we really want to focus on, let's get those privileged credentials, manage them centrally, but also facilitate the usage of them. Instead, from our side, we do that, what we call that server PAM, that's more focused on the administrative user that needs more access. Privilege manager, focused on endpoints. So I'm a user, I need to install a printer. Do I need to be a local admin? Probably not. Do I need administrative rights to install that? Yes, likely. How can I facilitate that process? And in the end, DevOps Secret Vault, to facilitate that as well, like the DevOps use cases as well. Again, phase two, like the written out explanation on those different phases. And then the last phase, like the phase three, is really all around how can we even be more like intelligent and more granular on these different items, meaning we're going to look at behavior, like usage of these different things in the environment. We're going to use automation, intelligence, like to use like the fashion term like AI or machine learning to understand how accounts are being used, by who are they being used, when are they being used, and make smart decisions based on that. Privilege elevation, even at a further stage, where like we can even go as far as saying, oh, dear admin, we see a lot of organizations still using like their personal account and an ADM account. So I've got Patrick and I've got ADM Patrick, and ADM Patrick maybe is a domain admin, because I'm doing a lot of administrative work and it's annoying to get that rid of that. So why shall we not remove those privileges of the account, or maybe just say to the user, well, here's only your Patrick account and you can do everything you need to do with that account, but allow them with that account log on a system in a secure way and elevate their privileges when they need them. Let's say I need to do something as a domain admin. Do I need to be a domain admin on the full environment? Probably not. Probably only need to be domain admin on a handful of boxes to do more what I need to do. So why not go as granular as that, removing administrative rights, still give the user the rights that it needs to do what it needs to do. And of course, there's still a lot of puzzle pieces involved, meaning service accounts, they're being used. The most simple example, I've got a Windows service running on a Windows box. If I change the password of that account in Active Directory, and I don't reconfigure the actual service, it will break. So what we want to do is also what we call like map dependencies. So we know where a privileged account is being used by an application or a service. So if we change the password of the account, the depending service also gets reconfigured. So even more dynamics that we put around that. And of course, like the whole, like the continuous, like one of my colleagues tend to explain it, like the continuous digital polygraph. You constantly need to prove that who you say you are, you actually are. If I need to log on a specific system, that system is very secure, I need to use multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication, what kind of multi-factor authentication is that? Like integration with like stuff that we have ourselves, something else. But also, if I need more privileges, so the example, I am this user and I need to do domain administrative activity, can I make that decision on my own? Or do I need to involve other people? As in, before I get that role, before I can do what I want to do, someone needs to say yes or no. Or I need to tell the system, oh, I'm doing that based on the fact that I have this open ticket, doing the validation on that side. So there's a lot of controls that we can put around that, where we go from this, like this base area, going from like nothing essentially, or virtually nothing, to having this central place where things are being stored in a controlled fashion, to all the right, where we say we're going to look at behavior of users, we're going to do privilege elevation, and we're removing a lot of rights. Because when we remove privilege and we reduce the attack surface, even if my administrative account got breached, maybe my account doesn't even have any privileges, so why do I care? That's kind of like the vision idea that we really want to work towards with that. And of course, like the question, like this is the way how we do it. So what we do is, what we've built is like we've got our Delinea platform. The Delinea platform consists out of different products and solutions based on what we call like use cases. Where Secret Server, like the Vault, it's kind of like SaaS, it's a Vault, it's where we store credentials. Behavior analytics, again, like the name says what it needs to do. Privilege manager is managing privileges on endpoints. So we've got these different products and solutions that we tie in there, which essentially makes it possible for us to, on one hand, deal with the people that need privileges. So your identities, that can be humans, that can be processes, can be services or applications. They can utilize these things that are in the middle, and in the end, we're talking about business outcome, getting these different things in place. So PAM maturity, it's like, but I think that's what always all security, like there's so much choice out there, there's so many vendors, there's so many different things that we can deal with. Privileged access management or privileged account management, it's to a degree a very basic control, but it does fix a lot of problems. It fixes a lot of issues. And it gives you much more control and security. And we even say, and it's more of a side comment, we see a lot of, like in the UK, for example, we see cyber insurance, like really a lot. Cyber insurance companies in these days have more strict controls as to what do you need to have implemented before you get an insurance with us, and what's your premium going to be. And what we're actually seeing is that having a PAM solution in place is actually one of the requirements that these cyber insurances are currently doing. So PAM, like if you're not started on the PAM journey yet, you can start fairly small, as in central vaulting, getting more visibility, et cetera, to like the full extent of all the fancy advanced activities that we want to do there. That's it. What I wanted to say. I mean, if there's any questions or comments from the room, I'll throw the thing around if there are questions.
Yep, still works. Good. Way at the end of your nice little graph, it said the DevOps secret server thingy. Does that only include credentials, or can I put anything in there like encryption keys, certificates? Can they even generate them?
Yes, and yes.
Really?
Like the name said, like it's a vault. So what we do from a DevOps stand, but DevOps kind of like does different things. So we can tackle DevOps use cases with like our like more human-based vaulting. What we tend to see in the DevOps world is the way that things authenticate, like a username and password doesn't exist. So for example, when I use machine-based authentication, I want to like generate leave certificates, epidermal SSH keys. From a what can we store, in essence, what we store in a vault is nothing more than a JSON object. So if you want to throw in like a certificate or a key or a key value pair in,
right?
Whatever.
Cool.
Any other questions?
What are the number of platforms supported? There's standard Windows as well as Linux. Is Amazon Web Services is a common thing. Azure is very big, especially in small medium business. And there are also multiple cloud services. For example, Exact Online, Ava Software, all popular applications.
Yeah, it's always like the, what do you call it? In Dutch we say gewetensvraag. Like, there's a lot of stuff we can do out of the box. Like that varies from Windows, local accounts, domain accounts, Linux, Unix, AWS, Azure accounts, Postgres, SQL, like broad range. What we do, like, and we also know where there is a lot of there are a lot of applications out there. Can we support everything out of the box? Well, I wish. Do we give you the ability as a customer to, like, in a very efficient way, like, or create your custom password changers, heart beating, launchers? Yes. So from a support standpoint, getting something supported, being that like an out-of-the-box support, being that what we call like custom integrations, it's very efficient and very simple to do so. We always need to look at, like, what do I want to do? How far do I want to go? Because, like, take the example of AWS. If you look at, like, oh, do you support AWS? The short answer is yes. But then, like, what do you support? Like, you probably know within AWS, I think there are 160 different services, probably even more. How do you deal with all these different things? Varying from simple, I'm running EC2 instances, how do I manage privileges into those? Because the fact, if I'm an admin on AWS, doesn't mean I can log into an EC2 instance. So it's kind of this interesting balancing point that we try to strike. Any other questions? And I think, like, I want to thank you, everyone, and, like, let's have lunch.